jump into Blender, this is basically what it'll look like. Over here on the top right, this is called your outliner, and this is just a collection of every element that you have in your scene. So we have nothing except our 3D space, a bunch of. And then the very first thing that we want to do is add some kind of mesh, some kind of shape to our scene. The very first keybind is Shift A, and that'll bring up a context menu, cube, and you can also do the Shift A and then you can search for cube. You can also search for plane. You can also do a little bit of text, and I'll show you all these other shortcuts. All kinds of things that you can do with Shift A. That is probably the most important one, because that's how you start adding stuff to your scene. Then if you want to delete something, you can do delete. You can also do X, which will bring up this confirmation. Next thing that's important is navigate. You can click the middle mouse button and that'll rotate around a specific point. You can shift middle click to pan, so you'll notice that it's not rotating around this cube. So when you scroll up and scroll down, that zooms. Right click does this kind of behavior where you can just drag and select everything within that. One thing that confused me at first is you would think that you would just click on this guy and then you'd be able to just like drag him around. But currently what we know how to do is add a cube. We know how to delete the cube, and then we know how to rotate around the cube and how to navigate. Once we actually want to start moving this guy, keybind G comes in, and G is grab, so you can move it around in space. And there's a small issue with this because say we want to move it up in space, it looks like that's happening from this angle, but if we turn, we'll notice that it was actually offsetting it from the center as well. So you'll notice when I rotate the camera, it actually shows me a mini representation of the 3D space. Red line is the x-axis, and we can see that in this big space here, and we can also see it in this mini guy right here. We've got the y-axis, which is this green line. Can toggle it, so right now it doesn't show the z-axis. It's not on. If we press G, we can freely grab and move this stuff. But if we follow that with X, Y, or Z, we can constrain our movement to a particular axis. So if we actually do want to raise this further in the air, we can do grab Z and it will bring it up perfectly from where it was. And we can also do grab X, grab Y, so much cleaner that way. Another way around this is if you go up to the widget here, you can click one of these little balls. So like for instance, if I click the Z ball here, it will look at this scene from directly overhead. Like, so if you hit these balls, it'll drag it to that view. So in that case, then you can grab and freely move it because you know it's not going to move it at all. You get what I'm saying. You see what I'm talking about. Shut your fucking mouth! Next thing, size, S for scale. So when I press S, I can drag my mouse to proportionally scale bigger and bigger, or make it smaller and smaller. Cool. So that's pretty neat. And you can also combine this with the X, Y, and Z buttons as well. So if I press X for scale and then I press X, it will constrain the scaling to the x-axis. Now I can make it longer. If I wanted to make it taller, I could do scale Z and that'll make it taller. Cool. Blender pays really close attention to where your mouse is. So for instance, if I have my mouse all the way out here, for instance, and then I press S, you'll notice it creates this dotted line from the origin all the way to where my mouse is. So I have a ton of space to work with moving in and out. And if I reach the edge of the screen, you'll notice it goes to the other side of the screen. So this is infinite in that way as well. But the reason that I mention that is because this is an easy place to get tripped up. If your mouse is really close to the center and then you press S and you try to scale, the sensitivity is way higher. So you can't do what you're trying to do so easily as if you started out here and then slowly scaled it in. Let's add some other objects for fun. So I'm going to use the select here, select everything. I'm going to control C and then control V. So what actually happened here is you'll notice in the outliner, it did in fact add 3 more meshes. It did actually copy and paste everything, but it doesn't look like it because they inhabit the exact same space that the original objects did. So it looks no different, and that can be pretty confusing. So we can't see it yet because we need to grab and move it away. And if you ever see this kind of clipping effect going on, it's for that reason. It's because you have two faces in the exact same space, and it's trying to render both of them. How do we actually turn this into something, a file that somebody can open? So we could go to render, and we would have to render the image first, and then we would have to go to view render. But let's do that. If I do render, okay, we get an error because there's not actually a camera in the scene. In order to add a camera to our scene, which we need to do to tell Blender what we want people to see, we do that the same way that we add these meshes. So we can do Control A, and then we can search for camera, and now we can see that we have a camera inside of our outliner here. And just for clarity, I'm going to make a new collection. So collections are how everything is organized in the outliner, and you'll do well to start making collections from the very start of your project so that you don't have to go back in and try and organize things into collections later. So I made a new collection inside of our default scene collection, and I'm going to call this objects. 2 options are double click, you can rename it this way, F2, I rename it objects, I select all of these and I drop it in here, and then I can minimize that. So now we're just working with 2 types of things, which is our actual meshes here, our actual objects, and then our camera. So what it did was it dropped a camera right at the origin. We can do G for grab, and then we can freely move it around like this, but that's basically just to put it in a particular spot, but we still need to be able to see what the camera is seeing, and that is a particular keybind as well, which is 0 on your number pad. So when I press 0, it pulls up the camera view, and you can back out of this with 0 as well. I could, grab X, grab Z, grab Y, and then go, okay, I like that. But that's gonna get super old super fast. If you have to guess where you want it, go into it, okay, back out, guess where you want it. Okay, this is super inefficient way to work. So what we actually want to do is press 0 for seeing the camera view, and then really quick we can scroll up, and that will change how much of the actual view here that the camera view is taking up, right? So this is still what the camera can see. We can just see more of the outside scene around it when we zoom out, but I like to have it somewhere like here maybe. And then we're gonna go to this small list of menus here. And by the way, this is really common in Blender because there's just so damn much functionality. There are tons and tons of tiny menus, and sometimes it feels really frustrating. These small menus here, which are item, tool, view, Blender kit, and create, we're going to go to view, and that's going to open up this menu right here. And then down here on view lock, we're going to go lock, and this is actually camera to view. So if I select that, then I can close this, minimize this menu again. Once I do that, now as I move what we would normally think of as just our eyes, it's actually locking the camera to what we're looking, which is about 1,000,000 times faster than what we were doing before. So we can still back out of it. If I press numpad 0, then I can freely move around the screen, or move around the scene, I mean, and the camera stays right where it's at. We can affect any of these things, do whatever we want to do, and once we press numpad 0 once more, it pops us back into the camera where we can start moving around. Now we can actually render an image. It knows that this camera is the source for the thing that we're trying to render. So we can give that a shot. If I press, if I go render and then render image, it will bring up a new window, which this is actually what Blender believes is happening right here. So you can see it looks similar, but the issue is we have absolutely no light in our scene. So there are two ways around this. One is adding light, and the other is telling Blender that light doesn't matter so much. To ignore light and basically render it the same way that we see it right here, we're going to go to the render properties. And by the way, this section right here is called your properties tab. So if we go to render properties and then we change the render engine to workbench, basically what this does is it eliminates all of the lighting considerations that Blender is making, and it shows it the exact same way that we're seeing it right here. So render image. All right. Hell yeah. Now that that's actually rendered, we can do view render, and I'll show you lighting just for fun, to show you what that would actually look like. So if we go back into the render properties, if I set the render engine to Eevee, now if we re-render this image, we can see Blender is rendering it, but we're completely in the dark. What we actually need to do is add a light. So we're going to do Shift A, and then we're going to do light. However, we can see that there are 4 different types of light, and the one that we are going to work with right now, because it's the simplest, is just sun. We can see this light, our first issue. The light that we dropped into the scene, it is inside of this mesh right here. What we want to do is try to keep this mesh right where it's at and somehow still be able to grab this light. And that is up here. So I'm going to move this out of the objects collection, and we're just going to call this light. Now, when you select something up here in the outliner, it also selects it in the scene here. With this light selected, we can grab X, grab Z, and I can move it up. So just out of curiosity, let's render this. The last one that we haven't talked about is rotate, which is R. So when I press R, we can freely rotate this in the 3D space. And likewise, if we want to rotate it around the X-axis, we can press X. Should be able to see this when we render the image. Hell yeah. Not super interesting, but it's still pretty cool. But what would be really helpful is if we didn't have to render this every single time we're curious what it actually looks like. And that is where these views up here come in. Each one of these spheres represents a particular rendering mode. And this is different from the rendering that happens when we export it to a file. It's always using this very last one. But the reason that we can select one of these is so that we can determine which one we want to be working with before we actually do the final render. So for instance, if I click this one, we go into wireframe, okay? So right now we're just seeing edges. If I go up one, now we can see the faces that the edges and vertices make. If we go up to this third one here, then we can actually see the texture on the object. So we're kind of adding layers with each one of these. And by the time we get to the fourth one, this is what is actually going to be rendered from Blender when we export an image. These buttons up here are just allowing us to peel back layers this mesh. So for actually being able to manipulate our render in real time, this is the one we want, the very last Where is the camera? It's right here. However, that brings me to one more really important shortcut, which is how in the world would we center our eyes on the camera or any given object? And that is right next to numpad 0. It's numpad dot. So with anything in the scene selected, if you press numpad dot, it will center our eyes on that that object. And likewise, when we rotate around it, it will treat this object as the pivot point. So this is huge because, for instance, say that I am centered on this camera right here. We're looking around and then I go, okay, well, I want to work with this cube off here in the distance. If we select any of these objects and press numpad dot, okay, all of a sudden, this is the pivot point for our rotation. This is the scale for our zoom. And likewise, we can combine numpad 0 and numpad dot to move our camera so that it focused on one of these objects. So I could go into my camera with numpad 0. If I press numpad dot, it will center our camera on this object. So that's super helpful because if we want to start our animation looking at this cube, we need to center on this cube. This is like a focus shortcut, and it works on absolutely anything. I could do focus over here. I could focus on this whole thing. I could focus on the light. And then basically the only next thing is camera automation. What we need to do is automate the camera position and the camera rotation. So you'll notice once I click on these different things, depending what type of thing I'm clicking on, this properties menu down here will update. For instance, if I click on a mesh, it will give me the opportunity to change the material. If I click on a camera, it will, if we click on light and then we go to light, we can also change the brightness of the light. If we click on any one of these different objects, it'll update the properties tab down here so that we can change different aspects. There is also a object properties tab. So every single one of these has this particular tab in the property, which is the object. And what this does is it actually keeps track of all of these different transform, right? So the fact that this guy exists right here is this cube right here that I have selected. The fact that it exists right there in this point in space is due to the fact that these numbers are set the way that they are. So as I drag this around, you can see it updates all of those to keep track of where in the world this cube is, or this rectangle. And likewise, I can also adjust it from over here. So I can drag this and move that. So right now, these just stay the same. No matter what I do in the scene, if I don't affect these guys, they just stay the same. However, there is functionality to automate all of these. And that is what these little dots are all the way to the right. And by the way, I believe you can lock these. And what these little dots mean is that there is no automation yet for this property. There's no keyframe, there's no animation. But whenever you see this little dot, that means we do have the opportunity to animate. So how do we do that? What we need to do is actually pull up an animation timeline. It's a little hard to show you, but like the outliner is one rectangle. The properties tab is another rectangle. And both of those make up this really large rectangle. And this rectangle is just a piece of the entire rectangle that is the entire. What I can do, for instance, if I wanted to get rid of the properties tab, I can click wherever I see this cross cursor. I can click there, and then when I drag it down, it'll basically delete this properties tab, and then the outliner is going to take up this entire rectangle. I can also eliminate the outliner. So that's basically what a workspace is. Workspace functionality. Then what we've got here, this is just one. I could set this up to be the timeline. My keyframes would show up here. If I wanted this to take up the entire screen, I could definitely do that. The one thing that you're normally going to start with is the 3D viewport. But from here, I would break it back out. You can divide this in two. Now we have 3D viewport over here and a 3D viewport over here. And for camera automation, what I recommend, we start with the 3D space. We split it this way so that we have the outliner. Then we split it this way so that we have properties tab. Okay. And now Blender is set up in the default way. What we need for camera automation is the 3D viewport, the outliner, the properties tab, and finally, if we split it one more time, we get the timeline. And then it's just a matter of moving into our camera once more. Now, once I lock camera to view once more, now as I move the camera, it's actually moving it in space. So, where do we start? Well, we gotta figure out a starting position for our camera. What I like to do is click on the object where I want to start, then I press numpad dot, okay, and that focuses the camera on that object. So now I'm free to figure out what I want to do. I think pretty much every shortcut, it matters where your mouse is, because those shortcuts can mean different things depending on which context you're in. So if I press numpad dot while my mouse is sitting over here in the outliner, it doesn't do anything. And that can be really damn frustrating when you're first starting out, because you're like, I'm pressing the shortcut, why is nothing happening? Your mouse needs to be in the right spot for the shortcut that you want to use. So we always want our mouse to be in the 3D viewport if we are trying to focus on an object. I just need to pick my first keyframe, and the keyframe is, for cameras, usually going to be 6 different values, which is the X location, like where it is on the X-axis, where it is on the Y-axis, where it is on the Z-axis, and then we also need to keep in mind the rotation as well. So we're going to focus on this guy. I'm going to get kind of like this perspective, and I like that for a first keyframe. So what we want to do is, we are not automating any of these things. We're not automating the light, we are automating the camera. So it's incredibly important
every single time
that we make sure the camera is selected when we commit this automation, because you'll notice every time I click on one of these objects, the transforms all change based on that object. But we're not trying to automate anything besides the camera. So if we're not careful, we can start automating. All we got to do is just click on camera. Make sure this is what's selected every single time. Okay, so we've got the camera selected. We've got our first frame. Now it's so simple. The only thing we have to do is click each one of these, and it commits that keyframe, and that's it. So now I could zoom out and say that I want to commit this keyframe now. What I need to do is move to a new location in the timeline down here and commit the keyframes there. However, you'll notice one thing really quick. When I click back here, it resets to the value that it was at, because it's reading from this automation. Okay, so this is a kind of a big workflow frustration at first. A lot of times you'll be working at a particular spot, you'll be like,
okay, I really like that. What if we move here and then over here, and for both of us, sweet.
Okay, and then you go down here and you're like, okay, I guess that needs to happen like 40 frames later. Boom, it's gone. Sorry. But it's reading the automation down here. So once you're ready to add a new keyframe, you have got to move this playhead to the spot where you're going to want to put your next keyframe, or else it's going to disappear. I don't know if there's a workaround. You have got to make sure your playhead is at the spot where you want the new keyframes, so that when it's time to write those keyframes, you don't need to move the playhead back to where you actually want it. Yeah, and it's basically downhill from here. So we've got our first keyframe, which we can see is right here. If I zoom out, oop, I'm about to do it. Look, okay, let's put it right here. Oh, look, playhead. Okay, so let's say 40 frames later, you can do 60 frames, 80 frames, whatever. And you can also type that number in right here. So if I want 100 frames, it'll automatically put it at 100. That's super helpful. Let's commit to 40. And then, what did I say? I was gonna move from there to here. Let's make this a keyframe. And I don't need to click each one of these individually. I'll show you on the next one. Go 80, click on this, press numpad dot. Now look, all of my keyframes disappeared because I've got the cube selected. It thinks that we want to automate something about the cube. We don't. We want to automate the camera. This is why we need to make sure the camera is selected every single. Okay, so the camera is selected. We're at the right spot on the playhead. And now, instead of clicking in all of these, I can click the first one and I can just drag all the way down. And then from here, it's just a matter of basically speeding up your workflow. So, I don't know. So when I press space, boom, and that's it. That's pretty much the entire process. Normally, you would want to spend many more hours putting together your scene so that it's like a cabin in a forest, or so that it's like this massive temple on the ocean, or maybe it's stars in space. You would want to actually build that environment and have multiple light sources. It's worth noting, it's going to move our camera through this animation all the time now. So we don't actually want to be viewing things through the camera anymore. We want to get out of that so that we can freely view these things. And you know, just as a note, one thing that might be helpful is to have this. So we've got a 3D viewport up here that we can just freely move around in. Down here, we've got a 3D viewport that is specifically the camera, okay? So as our animation is going, we can see the camera, what it's rendering down here. We can actually see it moving through space up here. Notice here in a second, yep, there's our camera. It's actually moving through space. Pretty cool. So yeah, a lot of times it's helpful to have like a camera view down here, and then all of the modeling, the actual editing that we want to do, we would do up here. The only thing that we might, like from here, the only thing that you would probably want to change is you go to output in the properties tab here. You go to output, and then you can change the output resolution, aspect ratio, frame rate, which will impact like how quickly, well, you know how frame rate. We've got the same number of frames, only it's trying to get to 240 in a second versus just trying to get to 24 in a second. So typically we just want to keep that at like 24, or even PlayStation 1 looking stuff. We might even want to do like 15 frames. Hell yeah. And then once we go down to the actual like output, general output tab, this is what determines where the output goes, where the actual render goes. So I like to go here and send these things to downloads. And then if we have this set to PNG, it's going to export a series of PNG. So the number of frames, that's the number of pictures it is going to render out. So for this project, if this was set to PNG, and we did render animation, it would render out 300 different PNGs for every frame in time, which, you know, it could be helpful. For most purposes, what you want to do is FFmpeg. So then, pretty simple, we just go render animation, and this will pop up. This is the render preview. Okay, and then once it gets to, you can watch the frames up here. Once it gets to the number of frames that your project has, that's when you know it's done, and we can just play it just like a regular video file. And I could upload this to YouTube. Blender is very frustrating at first, I think, because you inherently, in order to make something that you can show people, you need to do the entire process from modeling all the way to animating a camera, or at least setting up a camera, setting up lights, and then exporting it. So each one of those is like a little microcosm itself that you could spend weeks developing. Today we tried to do just a real quick project in like an hour, but yeah, Blender is much more satisfying when you know how to do a little bit of each step rather than
I'm going to spend a year just learning how to model correctly, how to do proper topology. I'm going to spend a year learning how to texture unwrapping.
It's much better to have just a little bit of experience, just as much as you need in every area that will get you to a finished product. And I think that's pretty much all I got. That's the, yeah, I think that's pretty much all I got. The long and short of it. Hell yeah. What'd you say?
Because it's like, if you don't even know how to render that, then what? You just invite people over to your house to look at your Blender project. It's like, who gives a shit? But if you share a video and you're like, look at this thing that I made. So I just took like every single,
We both have like lumps on our head.
Wow, this guy really knows what he's doing. It's a lot more shareable than if I invited you over to show you a Blender project or whatever. Yeah, that would be embarrassing.